Well, welcome. Boy, somebody just said this is the fullest house we've had since Jared Diamond spoke here on why sex is fun. So, Dan, I don't know if freedom is up there with sex, but it draws a good crowd in any case. I am Michael Shermer, the director of the Skeptic Society, the publisher of Skeptic magazine. Looks like this, our latest issue. If you subscribe today for $25 off the usual $30, you get your first issue here, which a bunch of you have already done. If you don't want to subscribe, but you want to be on our mailing list, you can just fill out this form. You can go to skeptic.com and sign up for the free eSkeptic, just so you know what we're doing and what's coming up. Speaking of which, here's our upcoming lectures here. Actually, 3 in a row here in the upcoming Sundays. It's usually we do once a month if you've not been here before. I think we do have a lot of new faces. How many are here for the very first time to a Skeptics event? Wow, that's very good. And how many of you, that's great. And how many of you have never been here before? Let me see. For you old-time skeptics, sorry about that aged joke, but for the people who haven't been here, it's a new joke. And if you did raise your hand twice, you definitely need to become a skeptic right away. So that brochure looks like this. You can pick it up here with the upcoming lectures. Looks like this. There's a bunch of them over there. So a week from today, John Horgan, Mr. The End of Science, and it didn't, so he's still writing books, went in search of his own personal quest for whatever, mysticism, spirituality, God, whatever you want to call it, and wrote a book about all of his different exploits, trying out different, sort of like Woody Allen trying out different religions, where he comes home with a loaf of white bread and a crucifix and a cross and a jar of mayonnaise, and it's that sort of thing where you go out and actually try it and see what it feels like. Anyway, John's a very creative, thoughtful, provocative fellow, so he'll be here a week from today. And then Sunday, March 9th, Tanner Edis has a book out called The Ghost in the Universe. These are authors on book tours, by the way, so we're really fortunate that they come to LA. This is all the latest intelligent design arguments on the cosmological constants and the large numbers and relationships of large numbers in the universe, and what this does and does not tell us about God's existence. The fact that he's speaking here gives you some clue he's, skeptical of these arguments. And then we have a break until April 20th. Dr. Christoph Koch here from Caltech, our own neuroscientist in his quest for consciousness. So he'll be lecturing on his latest research. He's almost finished his book on consciousness. He's the guy that did the research and found, the grandmother cell. You know what the grandmother cell is? This is a cell that only fires when it sees your grandmother or your mother or somebody you know. Koch found one that only fires, you have a little electrode right next to it, it only fires when you show the picture of Bill Clinton to the subject. So he calls this the Clinton neuron. So presumably, if it doesn't fire, you don't see Clinton, or if you destroy the cell, there is no, oh, you have it here on, Matt has it on his laptop. Very good, that's very good. The bipolar disorder. Anyway, thank you, Matt. What a crowd. All right. And then finally, Sunday, April 27th, Doctors Robert and Ellen Kaplan, mathematicians, lecturing on the art of infinity. So we got a good lineup, good crowd of people coming. We have one more flyer on the commercial here. This is our baloney detection series. We're coming out with a series of books for kids, science books, skeptics books for kids and teachers. These are the junior skeptic magazines that we've been publishing for the last several years, which we're publishing in book form now. So we're doing a fundraising for that. If you want information on that, we have that there. Okay, before I introduce our speaker, we usually do a little bit of shtick, so I'll read you the latest here from that scientific journal, Onion. God was diagnosed with bipolar disorder this week. I don't know if you heard this, but in a diagnosis that helps explain the confusing and contradictory aspects of the cosmos that have baffled philosophers, theologians, and other students of the human condition for millennia, God, creator of the universe and longtime deity to billions of followers, was found Monday to suffer from bipolar disorder. Dr. J. Henry Jurgens, a practicing psychiatrist and doctor of divinity, you'd have to do both, I think, at Yale University Divinity School, announced the historic diagnosis at a press conference. Quote, "I always knew there had to be some explanation," Jurgens said, "and after several years of patient research and long sessions with God Almighty," I guess, I don't know if they do the 50-minute hour for that, "through sessions of prayer, I was able to pinpoint the specific nature of his problem. Bipolar, or manic depressive disorder, is a condition that afflicts millions. Characterized by cycles of elation followed by bouts of profound depression and despair, the disorder can wreak havoc on both the sufferer and his or her loved ones, particularly if it goes undetected and untreated for an extended period. Though the condition is estimated to affect, in one form or another, 5% of the world's population, Monday marks the first time it has been diagnosed in a major deity. Evidence of God's manic depression can be found throughout the universe, from the white-hot explosiveness of quasars to the cold, lifeless vacuum of space. Up and down. However, the theologians note, humanity's exposure to God's affliction comes primarily through his confusing propensity to alternately reward and punish his creations with little rhyme or reason. Okay, so I gotta scroll down here. So then there's pictures of like storms and then peaceful settings, that kind of thing. So Jürgen says that God's earthly subjects need to understand that because of his bipolar condition, he's not in control of his actions and does not realize how they affect others. What he needs from us is understanding and patience, Jürgen said. To paraphrase the words of the Lord God himself, humans forgive him, for he knows not what he does. And finally, while such drugs as Paxil, Prozac, and Zoloft have proven effective in the treatment of bipolar disorder among humans, there is no modern earthly medicine that could be prescribed for a deity as vast and complex as God. Jürgens is in the process of forming a support group, living with a bipolar creator deity, so that all humanity can, quote, get together and discuss their feelings about living in a universe run by an omnipotent, omnipresent loved one not fully in control of his emotions. It's too funny. So if you've not seen Onion, pretty much every week they have some satire on, well, every week, yeah, on religion. So you just go to, I guess it's onion.com or onion.org. Just type in Onion in Google. And then finally, I always like to announce new scientific discoveries here. This is not science talk on KPCC. This is the two new additions to the periodic table of elements were discovered, wommium and manium. Wommium, the symbol is WO, and the atomic weight, well, no, we don't. The physical properties of this new element, generally soft and round in form, boils at nothing and may freeze at any time. It melts when treated properly, very bitter if not used well. The chemical properties, very active, highly unstable. Possesses strong affinity with gold, silver, platinum, and precious stones. Able to absorb great amounts of exotic food, turns slightly green when placed next to a better specimen. Usage, highly ornamental, an extremely good catalyst for dispersion of wealth, probably the most powerful income-reducing agent known. Not to worry, it's the other half's coming here. So the element manium, symbol XY, atomic weight 180 plus or minus 50. Physical properties, solid at room temperature, but gets bent out of shape easily. Fairly dense and sometimes flaky, difficult to find a pure sample. Due to rust, aging samples are unable to conduct electricity as easily as young samples. Chemical properties, attempts to bond with WO any chance it can. Also tends to form strong bonds with itself. Becomes explosive when mixed with KD, which is the element for childium, whatever, for a prolonged period of time. Neutralized by saturating with alcohol. Usage, none known. Possibly a good methane source. You know how methane's produced, right? Yeah, okay. Good samples able to produce large quantities on command. Finally, caution. In absence of WO, this element rapidly decomposes and begins to smell. So, and enough of this silliness. Dan Dennett's one of the great minds of our time, and we are lucky to have him here doing part of his book tour for his new book, Freedom Evolves. You obviously know who he is, since so many people are here. But Dan's kind of special because this is a science organization, Skeptics. Here we are at Caltech. What are we doing with the philosopher? Well, because Dan has done something I think important that Ed Wilson talks about in his book Consilience, and that is this sort of consilience, or bringing together, or jumping together of the different disciplines, the humanities and the sciences, the arts, humanities and sciences, philosophy, science, and so forth. And he certainly showed this with his earlier books on consciousness. He wrote a book on free will already in the 1980s called Elbow Room. He's done a lot of research on neuroscience. He's at Tufts University in the neuroscience department and philosophy department. Probably the book that really, I think, linked him to some of the major scientists of our time was Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Certainly one of the more controversial books of the 90s, right in the middle of the sort of rise of evolutionary psychology as a really legitimate science. And Dan brought a sort of fresh skepticism to a branch of evolutionary theory that probably needed some critiques, that is the whole Gouldian sort of branch of that side of evolutionary theory, and he wrote a long critique of that, as well as a whole bunch of other people. It's really a good skeptics book. It really hammers home critiques of a lot of evolutionary theory that probably needed to be aired. I remember talking with, who's Mr. New Kind of Science? Wolfram. I was talking to Wolfram about all this stuff, and I was saying, well, you know, there's sort of the sort of Gould and his camp, and Dawkins and Dennett and their camp, and he says, why do we have to have all this? Just say it the way it actually is. Well, because that's the way Wolfram operates, sort of in a vacuum where you just make these profound discoveries in isolation, but it doesn't really work that way. Science is a social process that thrives, I think, on debate and disputation and confrontation. That's where the action is. And where it's not clear what the data shows, that's really where these great debates, I think, fill in the interest for all of us that love this stuff. And Dan's been one of the pioneers in that. His new book, which I've just finished reading, Freedom Evolves, as you can see on the screen. So here, I think he's doing something important, not just another philosophy book on a timeless subject, but trying to do, as Ed Wilson said, it's sort of a consilience, a bringing together of different fields in the sciences and humanities and philosophies to try to show that in the future, I think, to be a humanitarian, a humanist, a scholar, an academic, you really have to be schooled in the sciences. The sciences are where the action is in the future. So everybody, artists and humanists and literary people, will have to have something, at least have a copy of Stephen Hawking's book on the coffee table, even if you don't look at it. I guess Wolfram's book now is the book du jour for the coffee table, and have some understanding of that. So we're fortunate to have Dan Dennett, one of the great thinkers of our time, one of the great philosophers and science philosophers of our time. Please help me welcome Dr. Daniel Dennett.
Thank you. It's a hard act to follow. I'm a little bit concerned now that the screen doesn't have my title in the middle, and I wonder if the projector is not going to read all of my screen. We'll soon. How curious! Never seen that happen before. Well, let's see what happens when I get started. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. I am honored to be in such distinguished company as my friends Jared Diamond and Steve Pinker. I know have given talks here before. And to have you come out to hear me talk about my new book is a great delight. And I'm going to start with a bit of humor, too. We'll see if this works. Hello. Well, not scrolling through. Hang on. Be patient. Sometimes these things. Yeah! Okay. Well, this Dilbert came out a few months ago. Dogbert, do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? Dilbert, of course. But how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose. Dogbert, are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? Of course it is, but it's the part of the brain that is out there just being kind of free. So you're saying the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for anything they do. Dogberg, do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Shut up. Now, that is the state of play on the free will issue for many people. And what it nicely brings out, I think, is that there's been a 2,000-year-old act of misdirection, which has made people think that physics is the key to this, the natural laws of physics, when in fact the key is biology and evolutionary theory in particular. And that is in fact the theme of my book. It is a theme, this is not my book, this is Lee Siegel's book. But I'm going to tell you about, this is a wonderful book, by the way, especially for skeptics. Lee Siegel is a professor of religion at the University of Hawaii. And he's written this lovely book about street magic, Indian street magic. And in the book there's a great passage which I love to quote. I'm writing a book on magic, I explain, and I'm asked, real magic? By real magic, people mean miracles, thaumaturgical acts, supernatural powers. No, I answer, conjuring tricks, not real magic. Real magic, in other words, refers to the magic that's not real. While the magic that is real, that can actually be done, is not real magic. And I've decided that this passage sort of is an emblem of my whole life as a philosopher. Because one of the problems that I've had over the years is I write a book about consciousness and people say, well, that's not real consciousness. And what they mean by that is because it's not magic enough. Because I'm explaining consciousness as something which isn't in the end magical. And the same I've learned is true of free will. People want free will to be magical in the way that Dilbert suggested. They want it to be some sort of exemption or a truncation of the laws of nature. And they think, well, if it's not that, then it's not really free will, is it? It's something cheesy, something only physically possible, you know, not a miracle, as it should be. And this attitude of wanting everything wonderful, like consciousness, like free will, to be not just wonderful, but supernatural, that wonderful, is something that I've had to address and live with throughout my career. And in a way, the Freedom Evolves is an attempt, my latest attempt, to show people that free will can be quite wonderful enough and still be part of the natural universe. And the way to understand this is not by looking at physics, and particularly not looking at quantum physics, but looking at biology, which is where the action is on this topic. So I'm going to try to show you. But first, I have to say a bit more about the anxiety that is provoked by these questions. I think you probably all have seen, I hope you've all seen, the great Disney classic animated film, Dumbo. The flying elephant. And as you see in this picture, he's holding in his trunk the magic feather. There's a great scene early in this film when Dumbo doesn't know he can fly yet. He's managed to fly in a drunken state up into the top of a tree, and the crows, his friend the crows, find him there. And he falls to earth, and now they're trying to convince him he can really fly. How else could he have gotten in that tree? And they're trying to coax him off a cliff. And needless to say, he's very, very anxious about this. And one of the crows gets a bright idea, plucks a tail feather from one of his brothers or cousins, and proceeds to tell Dumbo, this is a magic feather. You hold this in your trunk and then you can fly. The scene is done with great economy. It's very elegantly done. They're going to use psychology, they say. And one can see that this is going to work. Now, imagine if Disney rewrote that scene, and just as the smart crow is about to hand Dumbo the feather, this other smart alecky crow, the skeptic, who saw the feather being plucked, knows this is not a magic feather, starts coming up to Dumbo to tell him about, this isn't really a magic feather, this is just an ordinary tail. Every kid in that audience would be screaming, stop that crow. And what I've come to realize is that in the eyes of rather a large number of people, I am that crow. Now, you skeptics know about this. There is the sense, in the case of Dumbo, this would be justified. Yeah, this crow, he knows the truth, but there's a time for truth and there's a time for buttoning your lip. There's a time when the truth will do more harm than good. Don't break the spell. And there's a very powerful sentiment out there that there are some, maybe they're true, maybe they're false, but they're ideas that are so dangerous that if we let people spread these ideas around, they will do a lot of mischief, however well-intentioned. Now, after I realized that this was the motivation for some of the criticism and some of the sort of bizarre, willful misrepresentation of my views that I was encountering, and not just my views, but the views of others, including Jared Diamond and Steve Pinker, I realized that those of us in philosophy or science who actually aspire to having an effect on a wider public do in fact have to play by slightly different rules than the rest of our colleagues who don't have those aspirations. We have to play by the same rules as engineers who build bridges and skyscrapers and the like, and doctors. We have to be extra careful not to do harm. And the fact that you've got a true idea that you're expressing is not in itself perhaps sufficient. Because what if your idea, however true it is misunderstood by many people who run off and do something foolish and dangerous as a result of their misunderstanding of your perfectly good idea? How responsible are you for the predictable effects of the misunderstanding of your ideas, however true they are? So I began to worry about whether or not I was actually causing some mischief or in danger of doing some serious mischief with my ideas. And I talked to a lot of people about this and looked at it very hard. And in the end, I decided, no, I understood the people who felt this way. I appreciate them. If I encountered somebody who wanted to put forward a claim that, however true, would, in my opinion, cause vast human suffering, then I would be strongly motivated. Whether I would act on it, I don't know. Thank God I'm not in that position. To do what I could to discredit this person, to squelch his views, to get him to shut up, if that's what it took. So I don't think the motivation is daft, and I don't think it's ignoble. I just think in this case it's wrong. It's a mistake. I think that the views that I and others have been defending on these scores, are benign, valuable, useful, although I grant that misunderstood, misinterpreted, especially if they're willfully misconstrued, they could cause some harm. It's a close call. So there are people out there whose attitude is stop that crow. As I was flying in today from Boston, and if I'm a little disconnected, it's because I was in London yesterday and stopped for 4 hours of sleep and a laundry in Boston on my way here. So I'm not quite sure what time of day it is. Alan Orr's review of Pinker's The Blank Slate in the New York Review of Books is a perfect example of stop that crow. John Cornwell's review of my book in the London Sunday Times is another. These authors make it very clear by the way they overreach that they're going to do what they can to discredit this message, and if they can't find falsehoods to declare, then they're going to find other ways to discredit this message. What I want to argue instead is that evolutionary theory, not physics, is the key to understanding the phenomenon of freedom. And in what sense? Well, it explains how we can be free when our parts aren't free. That might seem like a contradiction. How can the whole be freer than its parts? How can the sum be freer than its parts? Evolutionary theory lets you understand how that can be the case. And it explains why people get so anxious. Freedom does evolve, and it could go extinct if we aren't careful. That's one of the forward-looking messages of my book. Now, there's a word that we all know what it means, but we never use it. It's the false positive or the lost positive that goes with uncouth. And there's a lot of these words, gruntled. You're all very gruntled today, I'm happy to say. We don't need these words, but here's one that we do need, evitable. If only this word were in regular use, we would have a good term for something which is in fact very important and that has been misunderstood and overlooked by generations of philosophers. What I want to talk about is the evolution of evitability. Now, here's the view that most people find so obvious it hardly needs mentioning. If the world is deterministic, everything in my future is inevitable. I mean, that's just what determinism means, isn't it? If the world is deterministic, if physics is deterministic, then my future is inevitable. This is false. One of the main messages of my book is this is simply a mistake. It is a well-known mistake. I mean, it is well-known claim. It is seldom viewed as a mistake. It is flat out an error. And I'd like to try to show you that that's the case. Now, I'm not going to do that in as much detail in my talk as I do in the book, but I'm going to give you the basic argument. And it begins, of course, with just defining just what determinism is. So Peter van Inwagen, good philosopher, and although I profoundly disagree with his views, he has the virtue of putting things very pithily very often. The thesis that there is at any instant exactly one physically possible future. That's the view of determinism. Now, it's more familiar to most of us in the guise of Laplace's demon. This is Pierre-Simon Laplace writing in 1814 and giving us the image that more or less governs the thinking of certainly philosophers who think about determinism, and I think physicists too. Laplace imagines an intellect which at any given moment knew all the forces that animate nature and the mutual positions of the beings that comprise it. If this intellect were vast enough to submit its data to analysis, could condense into a single formula the movement of the greatest bodies of the universe and that of the lightest atom, for such an intellect, nothing could be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. So this vision then of you have this omniscient demon, but all you really have to give him is a snapshot of an instant. Give him the exact position, the exact momentum, the trajectory, the location of every particle in the universe, then you just turn the crank, and if physics is deterministic, the demon can calculate the next instant, and the next, and the next, and the next, and the next, and calculate the whole future. That's the vision of determinism. Now, what I want to show is that determinism, so defined, and that's standard definition, does not imply inevitability. Even though it does imply that if you rewound the tape again and again and again and again and again and put it back in the universe back into exactly the same state that it was in before, then exactly the same future would unroll again and again and again. That's part of the meaning of the concept of determinism. And the way I'm going to try to show this is that by showing that in deterministic worlds, some things are inevitable and some things are not. Well, if some things are not inevitable, then some things are evitable. So there's evitability in deterministic worlds. So maybe you're lucky enough to live in one of those deterministic worlds where your future isn't inevitable, but rather evitable, in which case the problem disappears, doesn't it? Now, inevitable means unavoidable. In fact, in French, it's the same word, inévitable. Unavoidable by what? By whom? By an avoider, or a potential avoider. What's that? it isn't just anything, it has to be something like an agent. Something that could or would want to or could hope to avoid something presumably bad. We usually don't want to avoid the good things, we want to avoid the bad things. So the idiom X avoids Y is what we have to look at. What is it to avoid something? And how can there be avoiders in deterministic worlds? That's the task to show. Now, in order to do this, I take a load off our imagination by using a toy world that is deterministic and that is very clearly and obviously deterministic, and show how there can be avoiding in that toy world. And that's a world that I've talked about in some of my earlier books, John Horton Conway's Game of Life. Now, this is a deterministic universe which has the virtues of existing simply on a plane. Imagine an infinite plane divided into squares, cells, pixels, and each square is either on or off, either black or white. That's it. So any state of such a universe simply consists of the whole universe with some of the squares in the on state and the rest of the squares in the off state. There's no in-between states. And now we have some physics that determine just how the next instant comes about. You'll see that choosing one cell, this dark green one here, we see that it has 8 neighbors. Northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast, north, southeast, and west. So every cell, this cell has 8 neighbors, those. This cell, well, it goes off the edge, but this cell has 8 neighbors. Every cell has 8 neighbors. And now here is the entire physics of the life world. If 2 of those neighbors are on, then the cell stays in its present state in the next instant. If 3 are on, then the cell is on in the next instant. There's a birth on that cell. If it was off, it becomes on. If it's on, it stays on. Under all other conditions, the cell is off. Now, I hope you can see why this is a deterministic world. Pepper the plane with on cells, any number you like. Some cells are on, some are off. The physics on this page completely determines which cells are going to be on and which cells off in the next instant. And then in the next, and then in the next. This is a Laplacian universe, but it's very simple. You think of all the work you have to do to learn modern physics. This physics, there it is. All on one overhead, you can capture the whole physics in a few simple rules, and you can see that it's deterministic. Now, what can we do with this? Well, let me show you. Here is the life world. This is, by the way, I'll put the URL. You can download this for free off a website, and this is I have all my students learn this toy now. This is a great teaching tool, a wonderful toy. And here's the life plane, and it's just got 2 little configurations, but I'm going to go up here to options and go into draw mode. And yeah, and now here I'm going to put a cell on here. I'm going to put 2 on here, and I'm going to put 3 on here. Now, what will happen in the next instant to this cell? Well, it has no neighbors on, so it'll go off. What about these 2 cells? Each one has 1 neighbor on, but that's not enough. They'll both go off. How about these 3 cells here? Well, this one will go off because it only has 1 neighbor. This one will go off because it only has 1 neighbor. This one will stay the same because it has 2 neighbors. But here, to the left and right, there will be a birth because this cell has 3 neighbors on and this cell has 3 neighbors on. Well, let's just hit the space bar and see what happens. Sure enough. Well, what will happen in the next instant? It'll go back to that and so forth, back and forth. Meanwhile, this other configuration is doing whatever it's doing. Let's just rewind the tape of life. And let's run it. that little simple thing took on quite a life of its own, didn't it? Let's make it easier to see. That's not all the way back. There we go. We'll make it a little bit smaller still. And then let's run it again. You see those little things going, darting out, heading off to infinity? Those are called gliders. And they're just one of the more interesting denizens of the life world. Just to give you a little idea of what sorts of things are possible, let's show you, say, rake gun. I like rake gun. That's a pretty neat thing. That gives you a close-up view, but let's, no, I want to go the other way, don't I? Let's look at it small. So you can see what it looks like when it's put into operation. Maybe I'll enlarge it a little bit. I know, but I want you to see it now. Woohoo! Quite astonishing. Well, it's a cute toy, right? What else can it do? Well, let's see. There's one more thing I want to show you if I've got it here. Glider eaters. Okay. Now, what you see here are two little gliders heading towards a thing called an eater. And if we pace it along, you will see what happens when it gets there. The eater eats it right up. Boom. Boom. Uh-oh. What happened there? Well, the glider was actually one cell over to the side, so it didn't get eaten quite as securely as the other ones were. These are immensely interesting, to me at least. Demonstrations of the variety that's possible in a simple, two-dimensional, deterministic world. What can you do in such a world? It's perfectly deterministic, and in that world, as Conway and his students showed, there is a universal Turing machine that is constructible out of gliders, eaters, still lifes, and the other denizens of that world. Out of those simple parts, you can build a universal Turing machine, which means any program that can run on this laptop can also run, very slowly, on the universal Turing machine that you can simulate in this two-dimensional world. So that it's possible to run Tetris and Word and any program you like, including any artificial evolution program, can run in the life world on the universal Turing machine that is constructible out of those pieces. Now here's what Poundstone has to say about that. This was written a few years ago, displaying this is how big the universal Turing machine is. It's 10 to the 13th pixels. Pattern would require a video screen about 3 million pixels across at least. Assume the pixels are 1 millimeter square. That would be low resolution by today's standards, even when I've had my resolution set back down here. Then the screen would have to be 3 kilometers, about 2 miles across. It would have an area about 6 times that of Monaco. Now, no, we could put this on a considerably smaller screen now. It would only be about as big as Caltech's campus or something like that, at high resolution. So in other words, not surprisingly on reflection, in order to make something as complex as a universal Turing machine, you need to make it that much bigger than the smallest parts. But then, how much bigger than the smallest parts are living things in our world? Compare them with the atoms of which they're made, and the answer is many, many orders of magnitude bigger. So the message so far is simply this: don't underestimate the power of a simple deterministic world to support surprising, innovative, flexible phenomena. It takes lots of design work to get the flexible things to happen in such a world. Where do these nice designs come from? They don't just come by people playing around at random. There are people who devote large parts of their lives to the hobby of creating ever more wonderful thingamabobs in the life world, designs. I want to share with you a couple of quotations from one of their websites, now defunct. The loaf reacts with all the junk the R pentameter produces as it naturally transforms into a Herschel. Miraculously reappears sometime later, leaving no debris at all. It is necessary to prevent the first Herschel glider from hitting the fading remnants of the reaction, and there is no room for an ordinary eater. But luckily, a tub with tail and a block can be used instead. Well, here's another one. Dave Buckingham found a faster stable reflector, does not use Paul Callahan's special reaction. Instead, the incoming glider hits a boat to make a B heptamino, which is converted into a Herschel, moved around to restore the boat. A compact form of the 119-step Herschel conduit is needed here, as is a non-standard still life to cope with the 64, 64, 77 conduit sequence. Now, I have no idea what that means. But it's pretty clear what these guys are doing. They're playing God. They are designing wonderful things in this world out of parts. They're sharing ideas about good parts and worrying about debris and collisions and the remnants of collisions and the like, and to see if they can make something ever more wonderful. Something as wonderful, for instance, as a universal Turing machine. Oh, by the way, Conway's universal Turing machine also is a self-replicating universal Turing machine. It makes copies of itself as it goes, more or less like bacteria in a Petri dish. It would cover an ever larger plane if you gave it room. Now, being fond of their creations, these folks playing God as life hackers need to protect their creations from incoming debris, from junk, from debris remnants that are lying around in the world. And that, as you saw in the case of the gliders coming in and being eaten by the eaters, is not a trivial matter. You can't automatically protect your just put a few sentries around the edge of your creation and hope to protect it. But it is possible to create things in the life world which can take some steps to protect themselves, that can move out of harm's way. Now, of course, in order to be able to do this, they have to be able to anticipate harm coming. Now, either this is because their godlike designers have pre-designed them to be particularly adept at getting out of certain kinds of harm's way, or they maybe even have to have some way of learning in their own lifetimes within the life world what steps to take to avoid certain kinds of harm. In other words, it is quite possible to design avoiders in the life world, and then we can ask such questions as, well, if you run this life world, some vast assemblage on the plane, if you run this life world for 1 trillion generations, for 1 trillion instants, what will be left at the end? And you can say, well, the harm avoiders are going to do better than those that can't avoid harm. They're the ones that are going to have a better chance of survival. And so in this way, an evolutionary process can go on in the life plane in spite of the fact that it's a deterministic world. Some of the avoiders are going to be better at avoiding harm than others, and they're the ones that are going to survive, and if they can replicate, they can make even better avoiders, and so forth and so on, just the way it's happened in 3 dimensions in a somewhat more complicated physics on this planet and presumably on many others. Avoiding harm has been the first problem of all living things since life began. Avoiding the destruction of self thanks to the inexorable impingements of the junk that's lying around in the universe. And if you can exploit some of those materials to make your life even better, if you can gather energy from them or information about other things in the future, better still. Now, one attitude that these, if we were to anthropomorphize these life forms, one attitude they could take is just, God will protect me. And indeed, Dave Buckingham and his crowd, they can always protect their creations. They can just hit this pause button, move everything over, erase some unfortunate debris in the world. They can cause miracles left and right whenever they want to, and then hit the play button and go right on with the world. More interesting, however, is the task of designing things which can protect themselves. Evolution can do that job as well as hacker gods can, and in fact, even better. And now you already know the main theme of my book and why it is that I say that evolution is the key to the understanding of evitability, and why in deterministic worlds your future is not inevitable. It's because you have evolved from a long line of avoiders, and you have become better and better able to avoid things because you can use your senses to gather information about the world's present and past and extrapolate the world's future so that you can see harm coming and take steps to avoid it. The evolution of avoiders is one way of looking at the whole process of evolution from the very earliest viral-like replicators to us. As this has happened, it has increased what engineer would call the degrees of freedom in the world. We have moved from there being just one or two ways to go on living to there being many different options. Whenever you have a degree of freedom, you've got the problem of how to control it. For that, you need a nervous system to provide useful control for the many degrees of freedom that have evolved on this planet. I was talking with somebody just yesterday, actually. I'm not sure what yesterday means, but very recently, within the last 24 hours. And he was telling me about these wonderful jellyfish he'd seen that go up and down and up and down. I thought, yeah, that's right, rather like a hot air balloon. You've got only one degree of freedom to control in a hot air balloon. You can turn on the heat and go up. You can turn off the heat and let the balloon cool. You can go down. But a really clever balloonist can use that 1 degree of freedom, if he knows enough about where the winds are, to provide at least indirect control of a great deal of the rest of the other dimensions of the trajectory of the balloon. This use of the control of degrees of freedom has grown and grown and grown and grown with the advent of multicellular life, and finally with the advent of culture and language. And we human beings are the most virtuoso avoiders that the planet has ever seen. We've had an explosive growth in evitability on this planet in the last 10,000 years and in the last 100 years. In fact, in the last week. There are things that used to be inevitable that aren't anymore inevitable. They're evitable now, thanks to the latest advances in science and technology. Every day we get an increase in evitability on this planet. A rather striking manifestation of that was recently pointed out by Paul McCready. Well, that's not my next slide, after all. So evitability is what matters, and it is strictly independent of determinism. In fact, if your universe is determined, this actually helps you be an avoider because it gives you more reliable information about what the future has in store. If the future you face is truly unpredictable, if it's really random, then whatever happens is inevitable. You have no chance. If you're going to cross a field in which you might get struck by lightning, the randomness of the positioning of the lightning blows is not something you want. If you can tell that there's not going to be any lightning for the next 3 minutes, you're in great shape. It's predictability that is the precondition for evitability. So determinism is your friend, not your foe. This can be understood, I think, only from an evolutionary perspective. From the perspective of physical determinism and an absence of a biological point of view which looks at agency, we can't see this spectacular explosion of evitability that has changed the futures of all the agents on the planet over time. This growth in a very real and important phenomenon, evitability, is invisible if you don't adopt an evolutionary perspective. Consider this fact. The human population plus livestock and pets now represents 98% of the mass of vertebrate life on land and in the air. 10,000 years ago, that 98% was less than 0.1%. That's the impact of the explosion of evitability by one species on this planet. But this, of course, creates problems. Philosophers don't agree about very much. I think perhaps the only thing that almost every philosopher subscribes to as a sort of bumper sticker is that ought implies can. Do you know the story about Jewish ethics? Can implies don't. That is not as widely shared an opinion. But ought implies can. If you're unable to do something, then you can't be obliged to do it. If it's simply not in your power to do X, then however nice it would be, if X were done, you can't be obliged to do it. Ought implies can. But as I've just said, what we've had on this planet is an explosion of can-do. There's lots of things we can do now that we never used to be able to do. And what the trouble is, as evitability has expanded, our reasons have not kept pace. Of all the things we can do, what ought we to do? And here is where people's anxiety about freedom really becomes important. Because we simply are oppressed by all the things we now can do, and the fact that we don't yet have any ethical systems or perspectives that tell us clearly enough what we ought to do of all of the possibilities. And here is where today one of the particular anxieties is so-called genetic determinism, which I argue in the book is a myth. But it's not always a myth. I want to contrast different ways that genes can affect your future. Consider Huntington's disease. As Matt Ridley points out in his lovely book, Genome, Huntington's disease, Huntington's chorea, is pure fatalism, undiluted by environmental variability. Good living, good medicine, healthy food, loving families, or great riches can do nothing about it. In other words, if you have the gene for Huntington's chorea, you are doomed. There's nothing you can do about it. That's genetic determinism. But the point is, that's the rare case. For most genetic conditions, the bad outcomes are not determined. Consider phenylketonuria. All you have to do with this is simply change your diet, and you don't have the bad effects at all. Now, as Ridley points out, there's a simple test. If you're at risk for Huntington's, you can find out with a simple test whether you're going to come down with it. Great many people informed about the possibility of this test decide not to have the test. Why? Because there's nothing they could do about it. It is simply a sort of terrible death sentence. And so they choose not to know something that they could easily know. That is, of course, I think, the reasonable response in a case of genetic determinism. And this is what people are afraid of. But notice that if the day comes, and it may come any day now, what with the explosion of evitability, that there is some move that can be made, some therapy that can avoid the terrible symptoms of Huntington's chorea, these people will be the first person in line to take the test. What you need for freedom is foreknowledge and a path that knowledge can guide. Are we then freer than we want to be? I've been fascinated to see that a lot of the anxiety that people have about free will, especially when they consider science and technology, is that it seems to be making life, for some people, freer than it used to be, and in ways that people find extremely discomforting. After all, if people can choose the sex of their offspring, go shopping for a genome that has certain properties and not others, use plastic surgery to change their facial features, and so forth and so on. If people can do all these things that were never possible before, maybe we've become too free. This is one of the anxieties that has to be dealt with. And the reason that it has to be dealt with is that freedom does evolve. It's fragile. This is the website that you can download Life 32 from, if you want. I'll let you just leave that up for a moment while I say a few more words. People campaign on behalf of this topic. At first I was really puzzled by this. I thought, boy, it took me a long time to figure this out. Free will is unlike, I think, every other philosophical issue. Very few people care about issues in metaphysics, the nature of causation, nature of time, just the past real. Who cares? I mean, most people, let the philosophers worry about that. But they don't feel that way about free will. And moreover, when you talk to them about it, you realize that they're not just arguing about it, they're campaigning about it. It's as if they are afraid that if the wrong view won, this would be a really bad thing. And then it hit me, well, they're right. Because freedom, the freedom that we value, depends on a supporting atmosphere just as much as life depends on the atmosphere, the oxygen-rich atmosphere, which itself had to evolve. The cultural environment, the cultural atmosphere that had to evolve to sustain the sorts of freedoms that we do, in fact, hold dear, the freedom to act as a free agent, to be responsible for ourselves, to be held responsible for our actions, to be allowed to go pretty much where we want to, when we want to. The conditions under which this is possible depend on a large manifold of social institutions and shared attitudes. And were those to evaporate, were those to go extinct, then freedom would go extinct too. Now that may seem like a bizarre metaphysical claim, but just compare it to one which is more readily imaginable. Let's think of something else which is valuable, though not as valuable as freedom, which also depends on a supporting manifold of attitudes. Money. The discs that we call coins, the pieces of paper that we call bills, all of the marks on paper and the records in computers that we use and rely on every day in our monetary system, that all depends on a tremendously intricate and interlocking set of attitudes and practices, which, if they somehow got forgotten, if we all suddenly woke up with amnesia and didn't know any of those things, there wouldn't be any money anymore. Money could go extinct. Freedom could go extinct too. So it's well worth preserving. The main message of my book is, if you want to preserve it, then understand it, understand how it evolved, because that's the best hope for preserving it in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dan will take some questions, but before we do that, 2 orders of business. There is a play going on in Ramo Hall just below us, so when you leave after the Q&A, do be quiet, particularly when you're going down those stairs, and it's really loud in the hallways here, so just tiptoe out and don't yell and scream, and, well, whatever skeptics don't do. So do be quiet on that. And we're going to do our usual dinner afterwards at Burger Continental. Anybody's invited. It's at Lake and just up from California, just a little west of here. So Lake in California, Burger Continental. roughly 30 minutes after we break here. We'll be there. I'm sure there's plenty of questions. Let's go ahead and
First of all, before I forget, I want to thank whoever it was who showed me how to change the resolution on the fly.
That's Matt. That's our
Matt, thank you. Thank you. I won't make, next time, you see, next time that'll be evitable for me. That's how it goes. Okay, any questions? I guess not. Oh, yeah.
I don't see how Life 32 is anything but inevitable, outside God's interference.
Good. I don't see how Life 32 is anything other than inevitable, aside from God's interference. Right, let me drive home your point. Every particular state of the life world has exactly one future, which just, it's whatever it is, and if you put the life world into that state, that's the state it'll go into every time. That's because it's a deterministic world. Now, in some of those, how many worlds are there? How many life worlds are there? Well, it depends on how big a screen you have, but it's in my technical sense, it's a vast number. It's not an infinite number, but it's an unbelievably large number of different possible worlds. Here, we can use the phrase possible worlds and mean something very precise and clean about it. There's all these different ways of having states in the life world. Now, it's interesting that some of these life worlds are just junk. They're just chaotic. Nothing interesting happens in them. And in fact, all but a tiny, tiny fraction of the possible life worlds are just junk. They don't differ, the junky ones, from the ones that are interesting in that they're deterministic and the others aren't. They're all deterministic. But in some of them, avoiders evolve. And, wonder of wonders, that's the kind of world we live in. We live in a world in which avoiders have evolved. We didn't have to. There were all sorts of other possible universes that wouldn't have had avoiders. But our world has avoiders, and we are them.
But they evolved inevitably from the starting condition.
Fine, but think of it this way. I throw a brick at your head, and you duck. Was that brick's collision with your head inevitable? No, apparently, because you avoided it. Now, you avoided it because the light bouncing off the brick into your eyes triggered mechanisms which have been evolved for doing just this sort of thing. So, yes, it's all determined. It's all determined, but he still ducked. Now, you say, well, you see, here's the fatalist argument. Well, you see, the brick was never really going to hit you. It was never really going to hit you because, after all, it was determined that the light bouncing off the brick was going to go into your eyes and you were going to duck. Some other brick, your back is turned, I throw it at you, it hits you. That brick was going to hit you, and it did hit you, and you didn't avoid that one. Well, you can't avoid everything. But the fact is that you're a pretty good avoider, thanks to determinism. Now, it is true that any particular event that happens was unavoidable. That's true whether determinism is true or false. If it happened, it was unavoidable. The events that are avoidable are the events that you see coming, the prospects, and then they don't happen because you take steps. That's what it is to avoid something. Now, you may think, well, this is just playing tricks with words. This isn't the kind of avoidance I want. Well, I beg to differ with you. I think this is the kind of avoidance you want, and in fact, I challenge you to find a kind of avoidance that's better than this. This is the avoidance that we want. This is the avoidance that matters. And indeterminism gives you no better kinds of avoidance. Now, I know that goes against the grain of several thousand years of thinking on this topic, going back to Democritus and the random swerve of the atoms. But I think it's time to just confront that tradition and say it was a mistake.
I have a question, Andrew.
Well, you next. You first.
The point is well taken, but I think it might be moot because I think in fact the world is not deterministic, other than in a loose statistical way. Do you think we live in a real deterministic universe where there is one single future determined from this moment? Do you think that's true?
I think it doesn't matter. Did everybody hear the question? No. All right. The question was, he says he thinks that it doesn't matter what I'm saying about determinism because our world isn't deterministic. We live in a world, we've all heard about how quantum physics shows us that our world isn't deterministic after all. And so the fact is that there isn't a single future. And you say it's deterministic only in a loose sense. Well, that's a view that is shared by very many people. But I think it's a mistaken view in the following regard. Indeed, at the subatomic level, our world is apparently indeterministic, and because there can be amplification of subatomic indeterminacies, we can get large-scale indeterministic events anytime we want to in our world. I'm going to allow you that. I think this is simply irrelevant to all the interesting questions about free will. Now, there's a tradition among philosophers that says that's not so. And since I respect that tradition, I go to considerable lengths in my book to give a sympathetic account of the best version of this that I have been able to find, and that's Robert Kane's attempt to harness quantum indeterminism in an account of free choice in his book, The Significance of Free Will, which I highly recommend. And I devote a long chapter. I'm sure that many readers will be reluctant to follow me through the complexities of Kane's treatment. But I want to give Kane his shot. I want to give the best case for indeterminism playing a role in human choice that I can, and his is by a country mile, I would say, the best. In the end, I think I am able to show that his account can't actually use the indeterminism that it was motivated to exploit. Everything he has to say can be accommodated within a model which isn't indeterministic at all. Now, this isn't the time or place to go into those arguments, but I accept that this is a very widely held opinion which needs to be considered at length. I've tried to do that in the book. Yes, no.
I'm a little disappointed in my inability to see a direct connection between what look like purposeful actions in the game of Life 32 and the exercise of free will in today's everyday world. And I was hoping you'd get a little more connectivity between these two topics. Is that a good time to ask?
Yes, it is. So let me again try to repeat your question. This gentleman is disappointed that he didn't see the connectivity between the, shall we say, the apparent purposiveness of the simple things in the life world with the more meaningful purposefulness of human activity. And you didn't see, that was a mighty big leap there, and you wanted me to say more about that. And I agree that was a mighty big leap, and I didn't have time here to do that. And I do attempt to take make that journey in smaller, more manageable steps. So let me give you just a few hints about that, how that goes. And I did say at one point that one of the tasks is to show how we can be freer than our parts. A little simple thing that you can take in the life world, that doesn't have any free will. It doesn't even really have any purpose. It's too simple. But it is rather like the earliest replicators on this planet. Bacteria don't have free will either. And if they have purpose, they may seem to have purpose, but they don't really. Let's agree on that. Bacteria don't really have purpose. If you don't agree, then take something simpler. Proteins don't really have purposes. I want that because I want to build from something which everybody agrees doesn't really have purpose to something that does really have purpose. And show that what you do is simply add more and more of them and add more complexity and more organization and system And you gradually build to unicellular life forms which have hemi, semi, demi, quasi purpose, to things which have hemi, semi purpose, to things that have semi purpose, to things that have purpose. That's the way evolution works. It's the same as with life. Are viruses alive? I don't know. I don't care. Say they aren't. Proteins aren't alive. But when you put them together, you get something that's, well, is it alive? Sort of, yes. What are the necessary conditions for life? Philosophers' traditional moves is to be an essentialist at this point. Say, here are the essential conditions, and we have the first living thing. This is the first living thing. But of course, the biologists are going to say, well, play that game if you want to, but the first living thing is going to differ imperceptibly and in no theoretically important way from its progenitor. And I spend quite a bit of time in the book on an argument. I love this argument, due originally, I think, to David Sanford. How many of you think there are mammals? I do. How many of you think that there have only been a finite number of mammals in the history of the planet? But now we have a problem. Because by definition, every mammal has a mammal for a mother. Now, that gives us an infinity. Either there's no mammals at all, or there's an infinity of mammals. What's your choice, folks? This is a paradox. Well, the answer, obviously, is we have to go via the therapsids in between the reptiles and the mammals. And now you can say that some therapsid had a mammal offspring. And you can pretend that there's some interesting theoretical way to draw the line. But the fact is that evolution works by sort of imperceptible, gradual steps, and there's a lot of little backsliding, and there's going to be just as good reasons for denying it's a mammal. Hey, its mother was a therapsid. What could be a better reason for denying it's a mammal than that? But of course, if we play that game forever, then we don't have any mammals. And what we realize is that everything interesting comes apparently in degrees, and you have to have these transitions from things that aren't free at all and don't have any real purpose through things that, gee, it's sort of as if they had purposes, to things that, well, you might call those purposes. And gradually we get to things that are, as I say, not just situation action machines, but choice machines. They're not just the beneficiaries of a bunch of hardwired designs which take them in good directions, tropistically as it were. They also actually have the machinery to represent the reasons for doing the things they do, at which point you have purposes. Yes?
Something kind of related to free will, the idea of strong AI. Are the robots going to take over?
No, but they could. That is, strong AI. Are the robots going to take over? I'm glad you raised that, because I think you're right to raise it, because I think the anxiety is the same. I think the sort of visceral repugnance that many people feel to the idea of strong AI is directly connected with their sense that this mechanistic, materialistic worldview that I'm putting forward is going to deny us all possibility of free will or responsibility. It's going to shatter our precious worldview. And I address this head on, right in the first page of my book, by quoting. I was interviewed for an Italian newspaper, for Corriere della Sera, a few years ago. And I don't know whether the interviewer wrote the headline, but I loved the headline when the paper came out the next day. It was, so this is the interview with me about my book on consciousness. And the headline was, Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot. Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. Bingo! Now, that's the view. yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. And they don't have souls. And what are these robots? In our case, it's, 100 trillion, give or take a few, who's counting, cells. A human cell is not so different from a bacterium. It doesn't have any freedom. It doesn't have any purposes. It's just this little mindless, little robotic thing. Now, Jacques Monod once said, the dream of every cell, no, Pierre Jacob, I got the, François Jacob, I got the wrong French biologist. The dream of every cell is to become two cells. Now, but that's not a conscious dream. That's not a purpose. It's just a built-in mechanical, materialistic propensity. Yes, it's always trying to become two cells. And that's the kind of robots that we're made of. Little things that dream of becoming more little things. And when you get enough of them put together in the way that we are, and you add all of the information that can modulate the structures, thanks to the evolution of human culture and language, then you get free will. Yes, sir?
Isn't all this an example of the fact that in science we use different theories at different levels? For example, by knowing all about DNA, we can't predict when somebody might have a heart attack, or by knowing quantum physics, we can't tell whether we're going to have an accident on the way home. And in the same way, the microscopic rules of life don't tell you anything about what these huge configurations are going to do. So at each stage of complexity, we use different rules. And it seems to me that you're saying that at the micro level, there's determinism. At the macro level, there's freedom.
Yeah, I hope everybody could hear that pretty well. I think your point about levels is one I heartily endorse. Yes. At the micro level, we have determinism. By the way, if you get Life 32, you can fiddle with the rules. You can change the physics ad lib. You want to see what happens if you change the rules for birth cells and death cells. I can't remember. I think yes, you can even do, randomize it. It's at least pseudo-random. So you can play around with pseudo-random life if you want to see. But in fact, you don't get any benefit from this. What is going on down in the engine room, down at the microscopic level, is simply irrelevant to the reliabilities, the patterns that are there at the higher levels. And for that, we need higher level theories. We need biological theories, psychological theories, political theories, because those are the levels at which the causal features that matter are visible. In that regard, I'll just tell you one other example which I use in the book to exploit this. I imagine a chess tournament between two chess-playing computers, except I put them all on one computer. It's two chess-playing programs in a program tournament where they're going to play 1,000 games against each other, A against B. Well, what's going to be the result? Who knows? I mean, it depends on how good the programs are. But suppose A always beats B. They play 1,000 games, different. Now we say, why does A always beat B? Here's a dumb answer. Well, because it's determined that A would always beat B. This is a deterministic system. It's a computer you're running this on. And indeed, if you start the computer back in exactly the same state, you reboot, and you run the same tournament, it'll run exactly the same tournament of 1,000 games with exactly the same failed attempts to castle or failed, missed opportunities to castle and so forth. That, at the level of determinism, tells you nothing about the relative strengths of A and B as programs. And it tells you nothing about why one program is stronger than another. The why is a causal why, and it's a causal why which is invisible to the lower level, to the deterministic level. You have to go to a higher level in order to see that. Yes?
So you referred specifically to Orr's review of Pinker's Linus book.
Yes.
I read through it, and it seemed to me that it was a very reasonable and skeptical critique of some of the non-rigorous claims of evolutionary psychology. What problems do you have with that review or that perspective?
Well, yes. H. Alan Orr evolutionary biologist, I think he's at Rochester, wrote a very critical review of Steve Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, in the latest issue of the New York Review of Books. Orr has a track record in this regard. He wrote an absolutely ferocious review of Darwin's Dangerous Idea for the lead journal in evolution, namely Evolution, which had a dozen major factual errors or just misconstruals of what was in my book, and accusing me of mistakes on one page that if you turn 2 pages later, I corrected. By the way, that whole, Orr was not content just to lambaste me in that technical journal. He then rewrote the review for the Boston Review, where I got to reply to it, and you can find all that on the web if you're interested. So I mention this because Orr has a track record of writing what are superficially very reasonable and very knowledgeable, after all he's a professional biologist, reviews of books that he doesn't like, such as Steve Pinker's book and my book and some others like that. If you look at them closely, you see that he I'm thinking of a good general term. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example from the review of The Blank Slate. He criticizes Pinker's line on psychopathy, where Pinker cites frequency-dependent selection. And Orr calls this an esoteric. He says he defends us with an esoteric feature of evolutionary. Now, come on, Orr. This isn't, A, it's not esoteric, and B, how to put this? In the past, Orr criticized evolutionary psychologists for being naive evolutionists, for not knowing their evolutionary theory. Now he's criticizing Pinker for not being naive enough. Come on, you can't have it both ways. The fact is that Pinker knows his evolutionary biology and is preparing a response which will demonstrate, I think quite clearly, that Orr is just inventing errors that aren't in Pinker's book at all. But I agree, when you first read it, it seems very reasonable. Yes, sir.
Yes, I would question your statement that quantum mechanical and chaotic indeterminism is not relevant to the evolution of free will as you conceive it, because from our knowledge of genetic algorithms, you always need a source of variability to drive the genetic algorithm. And if there weren't enough variability in the universe, maybe evolution would not have worked as it has.
Yes, I think everybody could hear that. And I'm very glad you raised this point. It's one I discuss at some length in the book. A very distinguished evolutionary theorist, this is the other Frenchman now, this is Jacques Monod, also thought, as you think, that quantum indeterminism was important for evolution. But I think he is in a minority of one. I don't think any other evolutionary biologist believes, that I've ever encountered, believes that you need quantum indeterminism as opposed to just chaos, as opposed to deterministic pseudo-randomness to drive evolution. Now, why do I think so? For the reason you actually stated. You say genetic algorithms require a certain amount of variability. Right, they require a certain amount of pseudo-randomness. Now, the day that somebody shows an evolution, a simulated evolution process, using, say, a genetic algorithm, which depends on real quantum randomizing rather than a pseudo-random number generator, then I will agree with you. But to date, nobody has shown any such thing, and as far as we know, every evolutionary process that runs with a, you could put a quantum randomizer on your computer if you want to, or there's a website where you can get real random numbers if you want to. They don't make any difference as far as evolution goes. I don't think evolution does depend on quantum indeterminacy. It does depend on there being lots of variation which is not coupled to the selective regime. That's what it requires. Yes?
Say a word about the success of the evolved avoiders in the life game. It seems to me, I mean, do we need to wait for the science of these things to come along to demonstrate the proof of your conjecture? Suppose we put in some random things, and suppose it always fails, eventually. Suppose the avoiders eventually always fail.
Well, in the long run, everything always fails, us included. But we want to mean something less than the ultimate long run. No, I think seriously, I think you raise an interesting point. I can't prove, don't claim to prove, that you can evolve avoiders in the life plane that are as good as we are. I don't claim to prove that. I claim to give a pretty good argument which shifts the burden of proof. I don't think anybody's given us any reason to suppose that they can't. But I can't do a constructive proof of this of any sort. All I can do is point to the fact that there is a universal Turing machine that runs in the life world. So we don't actually have to use the life world. We can just use computer simulations of evolution.
But we don't know that the universal Turing machine is capable of simulating the world.
No, we don't. We don't know. We don't know. And this is actually an interesting issue in one regard. There turns out to be a sort of wonderful law of diminishing returns here, where as our simulation becomes more and more like the real world, it becomes less and less feasible. So that since we already know that evolution depends on serendipitous collisions with lots of junk, that's what evolution depends on, what Doug Hofstadter calls spontaneous intrusions into the process. And it's very hard to model spontaneous intrusions on a computer. We usually settle for much simpler worlds. So this is, in a certain sense, an open-ended question. Yes, sir?
How would you frame what would seem to be the opposite of avoiding? To use your metaphor, instead of throwing the brick, you throw a ball just out of reach that they move for. How would you frame that?
Well, all right. Well, the opposite of avoiding is sort of getting or enhancing or approaching. Approaching is probably as close to an opposite. And how would I handle that? In just the same way. It's just the difference between seeking out and fleeing from. And we have lots of simple models of this in biology. We have phototaxis, where you have very simple things that head to the light, or they head for a change in salinity. They go towards places where there's apt to be food. They have various ways of detecting conditions that are either good for them or bad for them. And the ones that are wired upright are the ones that approach the good and flee the bad. That's tautological. And over time, this gives rise to reasons. You can start partitioning the world around you into those states of the world that as it were, unfortunate, and those that are good, those that are toxic and those that are tonic. And once you have that division of the states of the world into the tonic and the toxic, and the behaviors for dealing with that, then we're on the road to evitability and agency and life. Yes?
I just want to follow this last two questions up. We've evolved, we are at the end of the evolution of the avoiders. Then you mentioned the exploiter, the fact that there's an explosion of an explosion of evitability.
Yeah.
Now, does this mean that at this point, from this point forward, that the evolution of avoiders will become the precedent? In other words, are we at a changing point because of this explosion of evitability, and it's the evolution of exploiters that will become the dominance?
There's always been an arms race. Not always. For well nigh 4 billion years, there's been an arms race between exploiters and avoiders. And biologists have described many different examples of this, from the level of transposons and jumping genes to bacteriophages in bacteria, to every imaginable sort, it seems, almost every imaginable sort of competitive relationship between different exploiters and different avoiders. And so it goes. I don't see, all we've done is change the scale and the pace, but it's the same sort of thing. Yes?
Yeah. The key question regarding free will has always been, how do we translate X could have done otherwise?
Yeah.
Now, using your theory of evolution here, how exactly would you translate that?
Yeah, could have done otherwise. The question is about how can my view handle the phrase could have done otherwise, X could have done otherwise. And as the gentleman says, this has been a central pivot point in the discussions in the philosophical literature. And I discuss this throughout the book in a number of places. Let me give you 2 points. I'll try to be quick because I think my answers are going on a bit long here. J.L. Austin, the Oxford philosopher, has a famous footnote where he talks about a putt. He's on the golf course and he takes his putt and he misses it and he says, "I could have got it. I could have hit that putt." And we wonder, is that true? What does it mean? Well, he says, I mean, in exactly those circumstances, I could have got it. But if we think more carefully about it, we realize, no, that's not what that means. He means in very, very similar circumstances, he would have made it. And he precisely doesn't mean the case where if you replay history with every atom in place exactly as before. That notion of could have done otherwise turns out to be of no interest at all for any purpose. The interesting notions are quite compatible with determinism. And I explain that. But I think more interestingly from the perspective of your question, there's also the question at the end of the day of what does it mean when a person talks about a moral decision and we say he could have done otherwise? And here actually I take a hint from my colleague Stephen White, who in an elegant book of a few years ago, a very difficult but elegant book called The Unity of the Self, proposes that we have to turn the question sort of inside out. We realize you don't get a metaphysical answer to the question of what could have done otherwise means and then apply it to your moral and legal system. You work out the moral and legal system, and then could have done otherwise means whatever it has to mean for that system to work. And in other words, you let the ethics and politics drive the metaphysics. And in fact, it's not metaphysics at all. And I think this is profoundly right. What it means when you say, I could have done otherwise, is best understood in the context where you are, say, charged with a crime. And you have to decide whether or not you could have done otherwise. I mean, everybody has to decide this. But in particular, he advocates a view of punishment and sanction and blame, which gives the agent a particular role. And I know he's not going to like me for this because I found a very cute way of summarizing his position in a sort of bumper sticker slogan, which he will be opposed to probably, but I haven't checked with him. Thanks, I needed that. The ideal that any sane theory of punishment should strive for is that the one who is punished endorses the punishment as fitting, and this is not a coerced endorsement. And of course, we don't always get this. We seldom get this. But this is the ideal that should govern the way we think about our laws. And then we say X could have done otherwise precisely in those cases when X is responsible by that political criterion. And the reason this is important, if I may just go on one more bit, is I've said, and I haven't given any reason for you to believe yet, that political conditions are part of the essential supporting atmosphere for free will, and this is what I had in mind.
May I just take one more question?
Yes, sir.
Since Life 32 isn't a deterministic system, isn't it a misnomer to call certain cells avoiders, in essence giving them an anthropomorphic purpose, when in actuality it's just determined that they're going to be existing for an infinite length of time?
It's determined that they were going to be existing because they were avoiding things until they couldn't avoid them any longer. Just like you and me. I think that is to say...
In essence, they started off that way from the moment that the program was run.
That's right. They, through no luck, through no act of their own, they were born avoiders. Lucky them. It's just luck. It's also luck for us. Thanks.
Again, before